Hi, everybody, and welcome to Preaching Advent, the series where we're talking about preaching Advent. We're looking at the texts from Lectionary Year A, and I'm Reverend Jim Keat, the Director of Online Innovation here at Convergence. And today I'm joined by the Reverend Dr. Andrea C. White. She's the Associate Professor of Theology and Culture at Union Theological Seminary in New York. She teaches so many incredible classes. You've taught Phenomenology of the Body, Otherness of God, Womanist Theology and Narrative, Theological Anthropology in Womanist Thought. I feel like there's a trend going here, and Politics of Hope, to name just a few. You're making me wish I had gone to seminary at Union to take all these courses with you. Andrea, thanks for jumping on and talking with me today.
Thanks, Jim. So good to be with you.
The other disclaimer to say is Andrea is a congregant at the Riverside Church, where I'm one of the clergy, so we get to see each other quite often on various calls and meetings and things. So it's just fun to get to hang out and talk with you about Advent, and today Isaiah 35. So let's start with Advent, though. Andrea, this is the world's biggest question. What is Advent?
Yeah.
And then specifically, why is it important for the church?
Yeah, such a good question. Thanks, Jim. It's a complex question, really, and there are a couple ways in that I want to consider, and then I'm going to kind of disrupt the common ways that we think about Advent. So, a couple ways in, we often understand of Advent as a time of waiting for the coming of Christ, which means that we're celebrating the Christ event as the infant and all of the grit of that incarnation, the grit of the infant in the dirty stable with the animals. And we're celebrating the incarnation as what I like to call the divine affirmation of flesh. Mm-hmm. And often we get a little, in our westernized Christian tradition, we get a little caught up in what you might call a mind-body dualism, where we think of the body as debased and it gets in the way of the soul and the soul's ascent to God. But in fact, the incarnation in all its grit and literally the dirt of the stable actually is one way of understanding God's celebration of an affirmation of all that is material, all that is literally in the ground and lives on the ground and feeds on the ground, namely the animals in the stable. And there's nothing romantic about this. This is gritty. And it's also the notion that God is made flesh is divine affirmation of the body. So we understand the body as divine affirmation. So all of this is a celebration of the incarnation, the infant baby Jesus, and the Christ event. It's a time of turning to God who's being revealed to us, who acts in history, God among us. And in this sense, it's celebrating what God has done in a past event. So we think of the infant Christ, as a past event. We also think of Advent as looking to the future. Just as God fulfilled the promise of the past, God will fulfill the promise of the second coming of Christ in the future. So in this sense, Advent is a time of waiting. It's the in-between time that remembers the past and looks to the future. And this is important because the state of affairs, of our current state of affairs, is in a state of chaos and despair. And so what we need is a reason to hope. Advent and hope are one in the same. So in this sense, we want Advent to function like a theodicy. And here's where I want to disrupt our narrative sometimes. We sometimes instrumentalize Advent maybe in the wrong ways. And what I mean by this is that we want to justify God in the face of evil and suffering. That's what I mean by theodicy, of course. And we want to give an account for why we are in this state of chaos and how to live through it. And what the problem with this is that we've then created an account of hope, where hope is a rational account that can explain the way things are, because we have a way to reason our way to hope. And I would like to argue that that is actually the end of hope. As soon as we give a rational account, some form of theodicy for the way things are, we're actually no longer in the life of hope, because hope, in its theological sense, not its political sense, but its theological sense, is always a cousin to faith. It's always the flip side of faith. So when hope is really hope, it's only hope in the face of hopelessness. We can't give a rational account for it. It utterly depends on faith. And in this sense, it can't become triumphalist, but neither does it give in to despair. So Advent is actually complex in this sense, because we've got a theology of hope that is kind of grappling with the past of the incarnation, the future promise of the second coming, but right here in the chaos of life. And how not to become triumphalist, but how also not to give in to despair. That's what I think is the theological question at stake.
Slightly more nuanced than when I was a kid and Advent was simply the countdown until we open presents on Christmas.
A little more nuanced, yeah.
Wow. That is a fine line for a preacher to walk. But I think a necessary one, because like you said, we continually find ourselves like in these unprecedented times. When was it ever precedented to begin with? But especially with, pandemics that still are with us in so many ways, and, political conflict that erupts on every side of the aisle, it seems, and so much more that is still to come in the weeks and months after we record this, I'm sure. But yeah, there is so much circling around us that nature of what does hope mean in the midst of hopelessness, and how does faith have a place in all of that is definitely a road for the preacher to walk as she enters into the Advent season.
Yeah, and I'll play with that countdown to opening Christmas presents a little bit. In a way, it's living with the countdown, the agony for the child of living with the countdown. There's some angst there, will it really come? Will I have to live with this waiting forever? This is terrorizing almost for the child.
Yeah. Oh,
but also
that's
faith.
good.
Yeah.
That's a fun way to 'cause I'm pretty sure most everybody, child or adult, can remember that experience of the waiting and the agony and the anticipation and the restlessness that comes with it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Going back a bit, where you started with a celebration of the body and the grittiness and the dirt. Why is it that maybe it's Western Christianity in particular that we so easily slip into that body-mind dualism? How do we easily fall into that? And then how can we kind of rewrite some of those scripts that we might inherit that put us in that place?
Yeah, I think to be completely simplistic about it, I think it comes down to a doctrine of sin, because we're uncomfortable with finitude and our bodies fail us. We're
just going to blame Augustine for this one, right?
I'll blame Augustine. Poor Augustine and Descartes.
Yeah,
they're both the whipping posts for this mind-body problem. But there is something, we often think of finitude as something that we need to overcome. And I always share with my students, redemption is not redemption from the body. So we're not being saved from finitude. That's not the problem. But our sensibility is that if there's something finite, there must be something problematic about it, because of our desire to transcend, or desire to overcome that which is limited, instead of embrace, if you will, the grittiness of the finite and all that means. Yeah. So I think this urge to overcome an impulse, a desire for more. The desire for more is not bad in itself, but when it denies the body, we think of the body as I said, as getting in the way.
Yeah.
That's
interesting, the way that finitude we see as a problem, and so therefore only the infinite is good and anything that's finite is bad. And I think of like these seasons now as leaves are beginning to change on the trees, and it's like, wait a minute, that's one of the most beautiful moments of trees. but
Right.
it's the definition of their finitude. And
Yeah.
if they were eternally green, they'd still be cool, I guess. But I love those moments when they change colors and they have this cycle in their life, and our bodies
Yeah.
are in so many ways parallel to that.
Absolutely. Celebrating the death of the leaf. Yeah, yeah. In all its
That's
glory.
either a book title or a sermon title or something in there, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, let's shift to the text that you have focused a bit on. This is for the third week of Advent, Isaiah chapter 35.
Yeah.
So what's going on here in Isaiah 35, and how would you recommend that a preacher approach this particular text?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. This is such a great text. I love what's going on here in the 35th chapter of Isaiah, and I'll point out a couple things. Of course, we've got a lot of references to the natural world, but we've also got references to the human, and we've got a kind of back and forth, almost a dialectic between the human and the natural, and all of it kind of wrapped up in what we might call an environmental cosmic justice. Everything from wilderness and dry land and desert to weak hands, feeble knees, burning sand, thirsty ground. And there are two things that I think I want to point out in the text. In verse 4, we've got this, well, I'll start with verse 3. This declaration: strengthen the weak hands, make firm the feeble knees, say to those who are of a fearful heart, be strong, do not fear. And then here's the line: here is your God. So this declaration in the moment of trying to encourage the weak, the feeble, the fearful, here is your God. It's in those moments the declaration is made. And then the other thing I'll point out, verse 8, a highway shall be there, and it shall be called the Holy Way. So two things about this. There are obviously divine reversals going on, and so the big fancy word we all love to hear and never, hopefully I tell my students, never use this word in a sermon, the eschatological. These divine reversals that are eschatological, they're about divine promise of future and better life. These reversals, I would suggest, are actually a call to the listener, to the hearer, to participate in what I'll call a holy refusal or a divine refusal. So this eschatological moment, to avoid that, when I was talking about the triumphalism of Advent that we want to avoid that triumphalism, I want to invite us to hear the presentness. Here is your God, the presence of God, and understanding all that's being promised in this divine reversal informs the present. And imagine what our present what it would look like if we gave flesh, so to speak, to the divine promise. A highway shall be there, it shall be called the Holy Way. There is a way in which to walk in this new Exodus, a different Exodus, that doesn't destroy what God has created, but actually makes a new way for all that God has created. So God's presence and then the way. So I think of this back and forth. It's a play with the temporal. The back and forth between past and future is shining a light on the present and what hope means for the present. Yeah.
I love that. I love how it's not even static, but it is that we're going somewhere. There's this movement happening through, in the sense, through whatever the chaos we're feeling and everything it is, but the reminder that God is present even in all of this, leading us on this new highway, this holy way.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not a bashful God. God will come with vengeance.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and he will come. I'm back in verse 4. God will come and save you. a
Yeah,
terrible
yeah.
vengeance, terrible recompense, and God will save you.
Oh yeah,
I
this is definitely the God's on your team and not theirs kind of moment, and God's gonna come kick some ass, so everything's gonna be okay. And my God's bigger than your. But sometimes that's, especially in the context of the when this was written and the worldviews they had, that's what you needed to hear to have that sense of hope in that hopelessness and faith in the midst of turmoil. And you need those reminders, and we probably still need those reminders in so many ways. Maybe we use slightly different language,
yeah.
but we still need the same reminders in our world today.
Yeah, yeah, and it's hard for me not to hear the voice of James Cone, and the notion of divine wrath. A God of justice, is pissed off about injustice. Is
Yeah,
pissed
yeah.
off when the oppressed are made to embrace their dispossession as if it were a natural state of affairs. And I think of this vengeful God as actually a holy righteousness, a God of justice, who in the divine reversals will take issue with all that needs to be turned right side up. Yeah.
Makes me think how this Advent season and this particular week of Advent, this is the Sunday, December 11th for 2022, will happen just about a month after the midterm elections. And I think about the ways in which so many people who are just perpetually on the underside of privilege and power, and how, the political world is one of the ways in which justice can be done, but we will hopefully have seen some of that done in so many of these states where, and areas where redlining continues and where voter suppression continues. And yeah, it just brings to mind so many things, and the ways in which that political organizing work is in many ways holy work in our world today. And it's a God pissed off at injustice that we get to embody justice in the world around us.
Absolutely. Yeah, and Jim, I think it's necessary to say what hope is not. Hope is, because we often think of hope also in political terms, and hope is not historical progress. This kind of hope is a politics of hope that strives for what we might call the impossible object of a political fantasy. A political fantasy that's actually, one scholar calls it a cruel optimism for the dispossessed, who are rendered dupes in a social order where promises of freedom and justice are always beyond reach. This is also known as Afro-pessimism. It's a politics of hope that is the Calvin Warren calls the trick of the indefinite future. And so some theologians, Christian theologians, I'm thinking of Catherine Tanner in particular, she says what we need is actually the death of hope, not more hope, but the death of hope, when hope is optimism. So hope is not optimism, hope is not consolation in the face of theodicy, and it's not his hope in historical progress. There's something seductive about this Afro-pessimism. It helps us feel a certain way. Black feminist Jennifer Nash says Afro-pessimism is designed to work on our political libido, and it's seductive. And it offers a kind of moral certitude that's in the end illusory. And that's what makes it attractive, because it's at the level of desire in a world of uncertainty, and we want something with moral certitude. But at the end of the day, a theology of hope is, again, attached to faith. So the moral certitude, even of an Afro-pessimism, or even of an optimism, both sides, they're the two sides of the same coin, a pessimism and an optimism. It comes with this certitude that there's no guarantee, and there's certainly nothing within human control, which is why we so depend on the theocentric reading of this Isaiah text. That only God can make this holy way, and only God can make a place where the redeemed shall walk there and the ransomed of the Lord shall return. So there's a divine agent actively at work in all of this because we can't do it on our own.
Yeah, we can't. Well, I am convinced that if this is a glimpse of what a seminary class with you is like, you have just recruited a whole slew of preachers who want to re-enroll, because this has been more than a treat. All I knew is that you're brilliant, and every time I get to talk with you, I had no clue exactly where you take this. We just dissected a theology of hope versus a political hope. We went into Augustine and Descartes. We went everywhere you could go, and I wrote down a handful of new theologians for me to buy some books from, it sounds like, too. So
Great.
Andrea, thank you so much for every bit of this. This is such a gift and so enriching to so many preachers who are diving into these weighty texts this Advent season.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for having me, and so good to be with you. This was fun.